Hi everyone, I wish your day is fine. Here we are together again with the prisoner of Zinda. Here we are ready to start chapter 3 and to see what happened with Rasandil as the king of Ruritania after he accepted to act like the king. But before we know that, and before we start with chapter 3, we need to have some questions to remember what happened in chapter 2. So if you read the chapter, you can answer this question. Question number 1, what was the king's reaction when he saw Rasandil? Do you remember? When the king saw Rasandil's face for the first time, and why did he do that reaction? When he saw Rasandil's face for the first time, he stepped back in surprise and he burst out laughing because Rasandil looked like the king. They have the same face, just with little differences. Question number 2, how did Rasandil find the king when he woke up? Do you remember? When suddenly Rasandil found himself wet and awake because Zapt and Fred threw a bucket of water over him to wake him up. What did he find? When he looked at the floor, he found that the king was lying on the floor. His face was as red as his hair, and he was breathing heavily. And here, after that, we have 2 questions. Comment. The first one is, your joke goes too far. If you read the chapter, you would answer this question. Who said these words? These words were said by Rasandil to Colonel Zapt because Colonel Zapt threw water over him to wake him up. Last quotation. The last bottle must have been drugged. We must get a doctor. Can you guess who said that? Rasandil said these words to Zapt and Fred. Michael drugged the king to prevent him from going to the coronation and to be the king instead of him. So here we finished this part about trying to remember what happened in chapter 2. And now we are ready to know what happened with Rasandil after he accepted to be the king instead of the real king of Ruritania. After he accepted, time passed like a dream, and suddenly he found himself in the king's white suit and wearing his expensive watch. He found himself among a lot of important people walking together and going to the coronation. So on the way, Zapt started to explain to Rasandil as much as he could of the king's past life. He started to talk about his family, his likes and dislikes, his friends, his servants. He started to tell Rasandil everything about the rules of the Ruritanian court. And by the way, Zapt promised Rasandil to be at his side at every moment of the day. And suddenly, on their way, they stopped to have their breakfast. Rasandil said to them, by the way, the king is so hungry, we need to have our breakfast. So they stopped at the way and they stopped to have their breakfast in the restaurant. And by the last drop of his cup of coffee, he heard something strange. He heard a lot of people shouting and shouting, God save the king! God save the king! That was like a dream for Rasandil. He couldn't imagine that one day people will shout for him. And then when they arrived at the station, they found that the marshal was waiting for them without Michael. Oh my God. who is the marshal. The marshal is the chief of the Ruritanian army. So he is a high rank in the Ruritanian army. So the marshal was waiting for them instead of Duke Michael, and that's strange. And when they arrived and started talking to the marshal, he told them that Duke Michael suddenly felt ill and he couldn't come to the station, and that he was waiting for them at the church. And while they were on their way to the church, Rassendyll was looking all the time out of the window, trying to find out how Stursloo, the capital, is. He wanted to discover about this city. He found out that there are two parts in Stursloo, an old part with narrow and crowded streets and full of criminal classes. And by the way, this is an old poor area of Stursloo. They support Duke Michael. They were putting his photos in all ways. And the second part of the city, and a very new part of the city, and that part is full of the high class of the Ruritanians, and this part full of fine houses with gardens and wide beautiful streets, and they support Rodulf the king to be their king. And suddenly, while Rassendyll was looking and he's on his way to arrive at church, he looked again out of the window and he saw someone he knew before that. And when he looked at that person, that made him shocked and afraid, and he couldn't do anything. When he looked at the window, he found someone among the crowd. That person was Antoinette de Mauban. Do you remember that name before? I think you hear that name in chapter 1. Antoinette de Mauban, the woman who traveled with them on the same train to Ruritania. Do you remember? And when he looked at her face, he felt that she would cry and shout, saying, "That's not the king! That's not the king!" But fortunately, that wouldn't happen. And then, when they reached near the poorer area, Rassendyll decided to enter it alone, just to make people see that their king trusts them. And when they arrived at the church, he found someone was waiting for him. When he arrived at the church, he found that Black Michael was waiting at the church. And there was a beautiful lady. Her name is Princess Flavia. Do you remember? Princess Flavia, the king's cousin. So when he arrived, he found that Black Michael was waiting him at the church. And after the king was crowned among a lot of important people, and after formally he was the king of Ruritania, he left the church and he found himself side by side with the most beautiful princess he has seen before. He found himself side by side with the Princess Flavia. She was very pretty, classy lady. While they were in the carriage, they heard some people out of the carriage asking them, When is the marriage? When is the marriage? When will you marry? And of course, that was something worrying for Rasandal. But okay, he didn't ask Zabt about this part, but he will try to do better. He was worried and uncomfortable. But after a short time, the princess started to talk to him. Princess Flavia started talking to him, saying, "You look somehow different today. You look more serious and responsible. And that's great." And then she asked him something strange. She told him the most important thing. She said in that carriage, she asked him to keep a better watch on his brother, Duke Michael. She asked him to take care of him. And that made Rasandal realize that Duke Michael wouldn't give up and he wouldn't accept that he wasn't the king after all his wicked and bad plan. And by the way, this is the point that Rasandal was thinking about. What would Duke Michael do after he wouldn't the king of Ruritania? And if you want to know this, you will not know right now. You will know in chapter 4. But before that, we can go to ask you some questions to check if you can remember what happened in chapter 3 or not. So please, you can read silently first and then answer these questions. Number 1, what did Colonel Zapt decide to do with Joanne's mother, and why? By the way, while they were talking about their plan that Rasandal will act as a king, they felt that someone heard the plan. After that, they discovered that Joanne's mother heard the plan, and that was a dangerous thing for them. So they did something for Joanne's mother. Try to find what did they do for Joanne's mother and why. Number 2, what did Zapt promise Rasandal to do? Do you remember when he told him everything about the king's past life? Number 3, what did Rasandal note about the capital while riding through the streets? I think he found that Turslu has 2 parts. Do you remember? Number 4, why was Rasandal afraid when he saw Antoinette de Mauban on the coronation day? Do you remember? He thought that she would cry and say something. Try to find it. Number 5, what did Princess Flavia ask Rasandal to do with his brother? And that was a very important part. Last question, comment. You look somehow different today. Do you remember who said this quotation, to whom, where, and when? You should tell us all that about this quotation after reading the chapter. At this point, we can say that we finished this session of the novel. I wish everything was clear for you. Next time, wait for me, and of course, I'm waiting for you.